This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome folks to Core Brain Journal. Once again, this is episode 013, but today is our lucky day. Here at CBJ, I regularly chat with extraordinary neuroscience game changers in an effort to encourage improved understandings of fresh mind science discoveries. Our mission here at CBJ is to translate fresh biomedical insights for street applications on Main Street in any town. Today, welcome Dr. Craig Wiener, who adds interesting details to considering options for parents of children who are suffering with ADHD and executive function challenges. Thanks so much, Craig, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
So what we're going to do is give a brief introduction for Dr. Wiener, and then we're going to go ahead and tell you some more about his writing and his book and so on. So first, an introduction. Dr. Craig Wiener is a licensed psychologist based in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of children. Yes, that is, how do you pronounce it? I only know how to pronounce it that way.
Children?
Worcester. Specializes in the treatment of children, adolescents, and families. Dr. Wiener obtained his doctorate degree from Clark University in 1979. And in addition to over 30 years of private practice, he is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Fantastic. So today, that's a brief introduction. Take a moment, Craig, and help us fill in the gaps with a little bit of introduction, telling us more about your personal life.
Well, my father was a well-known psychologist, a clinical psychologist who I learned a lot from over the years, and that got me excited about psychology. And then I started specializing in treating kids. I had a postdoctoral degree at a place that was specializing in kids, and that's when I first started to watch what happens between children and parents and how the youngsters getting socialized over time, and then how the child learns to cope with the situations and circumstances they're encountering.
So who was it you became encouraged? Who was the mentor that you liked so much?
Well, my father was my mentor.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That was a father-son show.
A father-son show.
Fantastic. Yeah. Was he at Clark University himself?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Was he a professor there as well?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So you got started young. You've been at your whole life.
Oh yeah, I was decorating Heinz Werner's Christmas tree. He was a very famous developmental psychologist when I was a little boy, so I was exposed to all kinds of famous people in psychology.
Fantastic. What was his name again? I wasn't.
Heinz Werner. He was a developmental psychologist.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm sure some of our audience would know about him. So the issue then is, and your family, you've lived there in Worcester for a long period of time, or?
Yeah, since my father was professor at Clark, I grew up in Worcester, and it was a great place for me to stay because I had so many connections and familiarity with what was going on.
Oh, that's fantastic. So then, with him, you became interested in attention deficit disorder with children and executive function disorders, right?
Well, yeah, my father was always asking interesting questions about psychology and seeing things in a unique way. And I got interested in attention deficit primarily because I was interested in treating children, and it was such a popular diagnosis. I thought I'd try to understand it and make sense of it in terms of what I understood about developmental psychology and clinical psychology.
You know, thanks for doing it. I'm telling you, this is, to me, of course, I've written a book about it. Mine's over on the psych side, on the psychopharmacology side. But in our brief chat before we even got on this interview, we both know that it's still, even in 2016, at the time of this recording, is still confusing to many people. Many people are treating attention deficit disorder without thinking of the complexity. They just take a look at the picture. Is he hyperactive? Is he inattentive?
boom, and that's the beginning of pharmacology. And I hope that what we'll look for today is hearing some more specific details about the complexity of the background, the family background. So tell us a little bit about where you really became motivated to, I have to write this book about parenting children with ADHD.
Well, because it was a good exemplar diagnosis for what is now taken to be a biological delay, and I made sense of it in terms of how can it be a biological delay when the behaviors are so situational. And so I began to understand the problem in terms of it's a way to cope. Distractibility is distractibility under what sets of conditions with what kinds of material. When is the child hyper? How are the parents responding to hyper behaviors, or what they call impulsive behaviors? What do we mean by that word? What behavior is being described? Under what conditions is the child doing these things? And then I started to make sense of in terms of this is psychology playing out, not some consistent deficit in terms of nearsightedness.
I'm going to say what you said back, because I didn't know going into this conversation with you, Craig, that we're brothers, okay, on the same path, okay? The issue here is context and reality are not in the current diagnostic book whatsoever. Labels are the game plan. 100% thinking is pervasive in the country, and the idea that a person could be different in one context and yet different in another one, and how those things all work together in reality. It's interesting to me that in the diagnostic manual, reality and change and context are not in the book. They're just not in the book. Yeah, you have social anxiety maybe, but the whole situation isn't in the current that kind of making that kind of diagnosis is not in the book. So you've been on that. You then break apart context. Tell us a little bit about how you break reality apart and help parents understand the differences with their children.
All right, so I try to hear what under what conditions is the child doing the behavior they're talking about. Usually, the way I make sense of it is that ADHD behaviors occur in the child's response to adversity, and it goes with usually what other people initiate and impose upon the child. It has to do with evaluation, restriction, disapproval, failure. And ADHD behaviors do not occur under the conditions of the child's initiative, activities they initiate and enjoy, they have a history of success with. These are behaviors that occur only under specific times, when the child's excluded, when the child's being reprimanded, when the child's being restricted. They don't occur. What I want to do is do further studies about, what's the executive function rating scale if you analyze a kid with their Pokemon hobby? What kind of time management do they show? What kind of organization skills do they show? What kind of emotion regulation? What kind of delay behaviors they'll do? And how does that compare with what they do with their schoolwork? And why would it be so different if it's coming from the person's body?
Again, I like what you're saying. What you're saying is, let's really be precise about what we're treating. Let's not throw this big wet blanket over every kid that's moving around a little fast. And let's really look at the constructive, positive dimensions of a human being's personality in the course of development in real life. Absolutely. Completely agree with you. So how does that, just take it a little bit further. You have 5 now. Obviously, you won't be able to tell us your entire book, but if you could give us a hint about, incidentally, I'm going to stop right here to say to our listeners, we're going to have a drawing for Dr. Wiener's book, which you'll come up. It's going to be really simple. It's going to be corebrainjournal.com/013 download, all one word, 013 download. And you'll be able to enter a drawing for Dr. Wiener's book. He's going to shoot it out to you. We're going to have a winner, and they'll be able to get his book. So before we get into that part of it, tell us a little bit more about, you have 5 different aspects of how parents unwittingly encourage ADHD with their children. Could you break some of those down for us?
So what I talk about is reinforcement. So the behaviors get unwittingly reinforced, not by the even if the parent's not involved, the behaviors can get reinforced. Because the avoidance gets reinforced because it diminishes the discomfort. So the kid could be not involved with the parent at all and still do avoidance behaviors, avoidance responses if the material gets difficult or problematic or uncomfortable or hard. But
Craig, break that down a little bit more, because that's when you were saying you were speaking good psychology, okay? But sometimes our listeners might not understand it. So when you say avoidance and then reinforce, break that down a little more for me, if you will.
So if the parent's involved with the avoidance reinforcement, then let's say a parent starts lecturing about what the kid's supposed to do, should do, and have to do, then you get the tune out.
Gotcha.
And then the kid says, "I didn't hear what you said. I can't pay attention." So then the parent drags the kid to a doctor and says he doesn't pay attention. And it happens when the teacher, and then it can happen in all sorts of situations as soon as there's extended speaking, because it becomes a conditioned behavior to very quickly become distracted as coping response. It's not a neurological delay. Unless it's a brain problem, and then it's a medical problem. But these ADHD things these have to do with under what conditions is the distractibility occurring. And then you have attention, which is the popular one. How does a kid get attention? Loud, intrusive, noisy, fast. And often these kids are kids that were active. They are curious. They explore the world. Their parent has to chase them. Sometimes there are kids that are kind of dominant, instead of very shy and meek. So they tend to fight back against limits. So then it becomes ADHD behavior becomes a defiance of having limits. So then under what conditions and then the kid gets the parent preoccupied with them if they're touching the wrong objects and it could be in danger. And it's all based on there's no way to have limits imposed if the ADHD behavior is occurring. And then you have sometimes the kids doing antagonism, which is behaviors we all do when we're mad at people or something's wrong with our relationship. We learn to do things to irritate others and get back at them. And so there's
that's the third one, yeah.
The third one. And then you have accommodation, which means I can't do it, I didn't remember to do this, it's too hard for me. And then the parent or anyone else says, well, we'll reduce the amount of the assignment, or we'll reduce the expectation, or we'll help you do it for you, or we'll sit there, or we'll make you have a special thing, you have more time to do it. So there's all these social responses that come with people who are struggling to meet expectations. And then you have acquisition, which is often what they talk about as impulsivity, which is just irritable response, or operate quickly before the person can stop you, get it first, don't wait for others, knock people over, don't wait in line. These are behaviors that go with kids who get concerned about missing out, not getting their turn, not being socialized in a sense that they're attending to sharing in a way they kind of learning their kind of very self-centered action. So the therapy is, what are you treating? You're treating how to socialize a child to learn to share and cooperate and take other people's perspectives and to do more self-reliant things, which is instead of the parent cueing all day long, do this, put your coat on, do this next. So I'm helping parents help these kids grow up and learn to be self-reliant.
So good deal. So Craig, give us a specific example, because what you've done really well there is break down very typical problems that we see with children that suffer from attention deficit disorder, executive function problems. Now give us one example where you've helped a parent reconstruct their response to one of those specific examples, and show us how it started out where it was a problem and how you helped them resolve it, if you will.
So you take this simple one, which is the tune out behavior, which goes with as soon as the parent starts speaking, you get the yawn or the eye roll. So I help the parent learn to say things short and simple, and to say things positively, so the kid starts to associate the parent with something positive rather than somebody who's going to be reprimanding or shoulding and half doing. And so there's a language shift, and you get the child to learn to respond to the parent in a very different way. It's like anything. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. So break that down for our listeners. Exactly what would a parent would say, you shouldn't be doing it that way, you're bad, you were wrong. How should they reframe it? Give us an example of a way that a parent could then say more constructively, from your point of view, a way to correct that behavior.
Let's say, so what was going on for you when you responded that way? How were you feeling? Or I wonder how it would work out for you if you did it this way. How would you feel if you handled it that way instead?
Okay.
So you're trying to get the parents, the child has a, once a child has a sense of discretionary authority, which is that their view, their feelings are being considered and they count, you're modeling for the child how you want the child to then treat others. So there's a whole new socialization that goes on with these kids.
The buzzword that we've heard so much, I don't know if you're with it, but you're really speaking about metacognition. You're actually training the child to think about the way they're thinking. You're helping them become self-reflective. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. So you say, well, what are all the deficits supposedly that goes with this diagnosis? And these are kids' self-management, and they're not. How do you train a person to start to figure out how to make their way in the world? If I'm always telling you what to do, you're not going to develop your brain the same way as if you're learning yourself how to figure out these problems.
Yes.
And then, all right, so there's a whole shift that goes on with the re-socializing somebody to use their own resources and develop their own resources. And then the brain develops differently.
Well, I'll bet you see a lot of progress with parents themselves becoming better in terms of the way they're thinking about their own lives. Because if you're actually getting the parent to think about metacognition, observing the process of thinking and helping their child think about their thinking process in some constructive way, I can imagine the parents are even better in their own levels of conversation. Is that true? Is that your experience?
I think it's it. Parents are only socialized in terms of how they learned, and they haven't been turned on to these other ways to relate with each other in a family setting. So if they were trained, do it or else, or do it or you'll earn a point, and do this, do this and I'll give you this, do this, I'll take this away from you. That's not going to train the notion of mutual care and concern for each other, because you're doing it based on forced compliance and coercion. People relate to each other very differently under coercive situations than they would under cooperative situations.
So I'm sorry, please go ahead.
And helping parents learn what it means to socialize under cooperative situations.
So you're really helping, so the parent is taking more of a team approach. How can we do this together? How could you reconstruct this in some helpful way for yourself? And you're really helping them grow up in terms of taking more responsibility for their own lives. I mean, that's somewhat reductionistic, but that's kind of where you're going with it. Is that true?
Yes, exactly. It's precisely it.
Well, so then give me an example, if you will, and give our listeners an example, if you will, where you had a specific change like this, where you can think of maybe a child or a parent interaction where you actually saw this change takes place, and make it as real as you can for us, because people want to hear about these options. They're very interested in them.
Well, the problem of change is that how do over time people learn new things. Over time they have to shape a new relationship. So it's all about helping the parent and child shape a new relationship. So at first, a child's not going to respond to this nice talking. They're not going to know what it means. They're going to think that parents even try to manipulate them, or not going to trust it. So it has to happen consistently over time. That the child starts to learn that the parent isn't somebody to fear, but the parent's there to help facilitate for the child. And that goes on with the parent being consistent with the notion that you're trying to develop something mutually acceptable with the child. So I've been doing this for 35, 36 years, and all I can say is that this stuff takes a little time, but very quickly the parent starts to get the sense that, I get a very different response from my child when I speak this way and when I say it that way, and when I say it the new way versus the old way. And they see that the child starts to be more attentive, and the child starts to hear them better. And then the child starts to learn that if they have an idea, the idea could be received, and the idea could have some contribution to the family. It's not that it's, and the child starts to learn that their vote can count and their vote can influence what happens with the group. And this goes on over time as the parent learns these new ways of interrelating.
You know, it sounds very much like, and I'm having trouble remembering his last name because it's not fresh in my mind, but it sounds like the Polyvagal Theory. Have you heard of Stephen? And I think his last name is Porges. You know, where he talks about how you talk with people in a constructive way. That if there's a pacing that takes place, so a person can actually comprehend what's going on, and there's a relationship between the vagus nerve, the brain, and the whole gastrointestinal tract by saying it in a deliberate, careful way. And that's kind of what you're saying. It's called the Polyvagal Theory. I thought you'd get a kick out of it. Because you're talking that way, you would enjoy reading that book. I just can't remember the guy's last name.
Yeah, so the responses that get elicited based on how I behave towards you, you behave towards me, it's a very different transaction. Now what's interesting is the whole ADHD thing is all about the child lacks self-control, and therefore you have to provide the self-control the child lacks. So rather than developing the child's self-control, you have a presumption of an inability to self-control, because you have the notion of a brain delay that's somehow generated from genetics, therefore ever present and uncurable. So my therapy takes people in a very different place than in some ways I make the case that traditional ADHD intervention is based on a residential training model, which is you have to kind of overmanage the person and you put them on a strict contingency management system where you control their resources. And I think it forever you get the same result that you do in any institutional learning, which is the kid gets institutionalized. They learn to do all the manipulative behaviors that go with charts and chips and punishments. And then the long-term data is really consistent with what I'm saying, is that they're finding very poor long-term data from what they're doing with the ADHD group.
That is such an interesting point, Craig, because you're actually talking about life institutionalization, you know, and
yes.
and really diminishing creativity. You know, it's
yes.
It's like that very, very popular video on how come I'm blocking on this? I'm getting carried away with this whole thing with the guy's name and I'm stuck on his name. But it's a TED Talk. It's the most popular TED Talk, and he's talking about the girl that came in who was hyperactive, and he said, "Hey, I think you're a dancer," you know, and she changed and she became one of the leading dancers in Europe because he handled her in a constructive way, as you're talking about, rather than a diminishing way. Hey, you're all over the office. You're getting crazy. You just have to leave. And so that's very interesting. So let me ask you this: what would you say would be the key thing that you have learned that would be the biggest impediment to a parent actually beginning to understand and make these changes? What's the main impediment you see?
The main impediment, and the reason why I did all this work, was to have something that contrasted with the medicalization of our behavior. And it's pervading our society, where all of the variations are seen as delayed, deficit, deficient, defective, and I'm saying they're different. And I'm also understanding that the ADHD group, whenever the child presents with anything that makes it more difficult to socialize the child, which means developmental delays, language delays, health problems, intellectual problems, anything that makes it difficult to socialize a child, you're more likely to get involved with this ADHD patterning, just because it's more difficult for everybody to meet societal expectations through typical social behaviors. So I have no problem that these kids, some of these kids, or a large amount of these kids, come from a starting point that are more difficult to socialize. But it doesn't mean the ADHD behaviors are deficient or delayed behaviors. They're coping behaviors. that occur under particular situations and circumstances.
Totally agree with that point. It's totally agree. In fact, I see so many kids. I do have a large ADHD practice myself, and really, if you put the emphasis on the correct syllable, if you forgive my expression there, but what happens is so many of these folks have maybe a 20% problem or a 10% problem, and are 90% coping really well. If you can just find the percentage that's working well and emphasize it, and really move them forward instead of medicalizing it. I think it's a great term, and I think that is what happens. Because what happens, my own view of it is, I quite agree with you on the term deficit. What I see so often, and I'm sure you'll agree with me just because of the way we're talking here, is individuals who suffer from attention abundance disorder, not attention deficit disorder. And in fact, I've talked to some people who say disorder is not even a correct word because they suffer from attention abundance. And it's only the viewer that sees it as a disorder. The child or the adult may see that it's actually an affirmation and a positive attribute.
Exactly. So if, let's say, attention abundance, if that means that the child has kind of evolved a pattern where they get to be center stage and monopolize group behavior and the parents' behavior, that's an attention abundance behavior.
Yeah. Well, I think it's even attention abundance in speaking about it in somewhat negative terms, because they can have a problem with attention abundance in the complexity and the multiple variables of group interaction. So what happens with the complexity, they have trouble sorting the complexity because they can't seize upon something that they can identify with and actually work with. So they're confused about what to do, and it's an abundance problem, and only to the untrained the untrained people would call it a deficit because it looks like a deficit. But in truth, what they're having is a difficulty in the selection process and don't have the internal confidence to actually make the connection with something that is attractive, interesting, and could be helpfully processed in a good way.
So if the youngsters kind of evolve the pattern where once things get difficult, they kind of pull back and get passive and they take themselves out of the game, then they probably aren't going to learn what you're talking about them doing. So how can the family and the parent and the influential people modulate what they're doing to get this kid to keep tuned in and to start to generate these, find out something that's in it for them that they can identify with and become included?
Yeah, and how do they help the child find what he's actually interested in? If the child has no self-esteem and is doubting himself all along, how can he say, this is interesting to me and it's okay to be interested in it? And that is so correct. It's so much fun talking to you. I appreciate you bringing this up. It's interesting because I had no idea where you were going to go with this when we started the conversation. And we're going into a very commonplace situation for our own interests. Let me ask you a couple. We're getting close to a closing here. I wanted to ask you a couple of other things. What would be the source? First of all, we're going to have a link to your book. We've talked about the giveaway that we're going to have for your book. Thank you very much for that. I know listeners will be happy with that. But the other thing is, do you have another resource besides your own book that you would say that's been particularly instrumental in helping you formulate your ideas of where to go that would be additional reading resources?
Well, yeah. In fact, after I wrote my books, I found out about this person, Stephen Glenn, who was one of the mentors of Jane Nelson and all these other people that talk about positive discipline. But he's got a CD and a DVD set on the internet. It's Raising Capable Children. And when I listen to him speak, he sounds like he had the same focus. All the things he's talking about are consistent with what you and I are discussing today. I think it's a great resource for parents. When I teach other therapists, I have them listen to these DVDs and we discuss it. But that's a great resource for parents. Raising Capable Children, Stephen Glenn.
Thank you. I'll definitely put that up there for people. We'll have your book up there. We'll have the link to your book for people who don't get it. Did you say when we first started speaking that you had written several books?
Yeah, I wrote 2 academic books before I wrote the parenting book. And the first book was called ADHD as a Learned Behavioral Pattern, A Return to Psychology. And what it was an analysis of all the ADHD arguments for medicalization of ADHD. And I proposed alternative ways to understand all of the research that they're interpreting in terms of a medical defective model. And I said you could understand ADHD within the realm of psychology. That's why it's called A Return to Psychology. And if you're interested in this, all the subtleties of the genetics and twin studies and the brain differences data and all the functional empirical findings about functional deficits and alternative ways to understand what's going on with ADHD diagnosed people when they score poorly on particular tests. And what explanations are possible other than there's something defective about them.
That sounds interesting. It sounds very interesting. So that's one of them. And what's the other one then, Craig?
The other one was a extension of the first book, which was it was written for therapists and social workers and psychologists as an intervention. And it was what I called it was ADHD, a more collaborative, less medicinal, self-reliant. It was to develop self-reliance and collaboration with children rather than medicines. Less medicines anyway.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah. So I'm gonna have all three of those books listed. It's interesting as you just telling me, where you started was an academic, and then you moved to the next level, which is how to, and now you're really down to where the rubber meets the road with the parents. I mean, it's a very, very interesting evolution in your thinking, So
I did a presentation at an APA convention, and somebody from a book company, New Harbinger Publications, approached me, and they wanted me to put it down in a form that people could understand.
That the average person could get it, yeah. Yeah, it's tough. When you're as well trained as you are, it's hard to get away from the language constructs. And
I think so.
It sounds like you've done a really good job of doing that, because you have to get away from the language constructs to have an effective relationship with parents who love their children and want to do something in a constructive, positive way, as opposed to throwing stuff at them and just changing behavior.
Well, so I think the best things in life are said simply, like E equals MC squared. So if I can't explain it to you in simple ways, it's probably not that great.
That's a quote from Einstein. I will put that quote on your page when we do corebrainjournal.com 013. That's going to be your URL for the page we have over at Core Brain Journal. You get a kick out of it. So in closing, let's tell people where they could reach you if they were interested. Do you have a specific place to tell them where to go?
Well, I have a website, craigwiener.com, and my name is spelled CraigWiener.com. Then you can see the books and some of the things I've written. And then there's a contact Dr. Craig Wiener on the website, so you could always do that. And
oh, great! So you're in active practice right now. You're still busy working with individuals.
Yeah, I'm a clinical director at the Family Health Center of Worcester, which is a primary care facility, and I have my private practice. And so I train other therapists on doing therapy and see clients in my private practice.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate it. I know our listeners really do appreciate you taking the time today to come in and tell us about the very interesting perspective you have. I mean, it is very, it's a much more optimistic, less psychiatric way of looking at it. It's really what's going on with a human being in a constructive way, and we really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So we'll sign off now, and we look forward to possibly talking to you again on the flip side, Craig. You have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications
like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.